General Sani Abacha didn't rob Nigeria with a gun. He robbed it with a pen. Between 1993 and 1998, Nigeria's military dictator perfected a theft system so brazen, so systematic, that it makes other African corruption scandals look amateurish. He didn't bother with fake contracts or phantom projects. He simply wrote letters to the central bank requesting security funds. No explanations, no itemized budgets, no oversight. Within hours, cash would be loaded into trucks. Hundreds of millions of naira, billions in today's money, sometimes in travelers' checks, often in US dollar bills. The trucks would drive to Abacha's residence. The money would be unloaded, and most of it would vanish into briefcases, onto private planes, into Swiss bank accounts. Over 5 years, Abacha stole between $3 billion and $5 billion from Nigeria's treasury. Not gradually, not secretly, but openly, systematically, with the entire machinery of state helping him do it. And when he died suddenly in 1998, reportedly in bed with Indian prostitutes, his body pumped full of Viagra, the money hunt began. It would become the longest, most complex asset recovery operation in African history. 25 years later, Nigeria is still finding Abacha's money, still fighting in foreign courts, still discovering new accounts. This is the story of how a dictator looted a nation by the truckload, how Western banks became his accomplices, and how the vaults he built across the world became monuments to impunity. Nigeria in 1993 was supposed to be returning to democracy. After years of military rule, the country held elections. Masud Abiola, a wealthy businessman, won convincingly. But the military annulled the results. Chaos erupted, protests, violence, political crisis. And in November 1993, General Sani Abacha, the defense minister, seized power in a bloodless coup. Abacha promised stability, a transition back to civilian rule, temporary military oversight. He lied. For the next 5 years, Abacha would rule Nigeria with absolute brutality. Journalists were jailed. Activists were murdered. Opposition leaders were hanged. Ken Saro-Wiwa, the environmental activist and writer, was executed in 1995 despite international outcry. Masud Abiola, the rightful election winner, was imprisoned. He would die in detention in 1998. Nigeria became a pariah state. Sanctions followed. International isolation grew. But while the world condemned Abacha's human rights abuses, something else was happening. He was robbing Nigeria blind. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest oil producers. In the 1990s, despite economic mismanagement and corruption, billions of dollars flowed into government coffers annually. Abacha controlled all of it. As military head of state, he had absolute power. No parliament to answer to, no opposition to challenge him, no free press to investigate. He created a system where money could be extracted from the Nigerian state without scrutiny. The mechanism was called security votes. Security votes were discretionary funds allocated to the president and governors for undefined security purposes. No receipts required, no audits, no accountability. In theory, the money was for intelligence operations, emergency security measures, things that couldn't be publicly disclosed. In practice, it was a slush fund, and Abacha exploited it ruthlessly. Here's how it worked. Abacha would write a brief letter to the Central Bank of Nigeria requesting funds for security. His national security advisor, Ismaila Gwarzo, would deliver the letter. Central bank officials would process the request immediately, no questions asked, because asking questions under a military dictatorship could be fatal. The money would be withdrawn, sometimes hundreds of millions of naira at a time. It would be converted into US dollars or traveler's checks, then loaded into vehicles and driven to Abacha's residence or to designated locations. This wasn't occasional. It was systematic. Central bank records later showed that between 1993 and 1998, Abacha withdrew over $2 billion in cash through these security vote requests. $2 billion in cash delivered by truck. But that was just the beginning. Abacha also controlled Nigeria's oil revenue directly. As head of state, he had authority over the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. He could direct how oil revenue was allocated. Contracts were awarded to shell companies secretly controlled by him and his family. Oil blocks were given to front men who paid kickbacks. Revenues that should have gone to the treasury were diverted to private accounts. One of Abacha's key accomplices was his national security advisor, Ismaila Gwarzo. Gwarzo coordinated the logistics. He opened bank accounts. He established shell companies. He arranged the money transfers. Another key player was Mohammed Abacha, the dictator's son. Mohammed controlled many of the front companies used to launder stolen funds. And then there was Abubakar Atiku Bagudu, a businessman and associate who managed investments and helped move money offshore. Together, they built a global laundering machine. The money flowed in 3 stages. Stage 1, extraction. Cash was withdrawn from the central bank or diverted from oil revenues. This happened inside Nigeria, using Abacha's authority as head of state. Stage 2, movement. The cash was physically moved out of Nigeria or converted into financial instruments. Wire transfers, traveler's checks, letters of credit. Private jets carried briefcases stuffed with dollars to London, Switzerland, and other banking hubs. Stage 3, laundering. Once offshore, the money was deposited into accounts held by shell companies. These companies had innocuous names: Morgan Procurement, Ridley Trading, Delsabil Foundation, Doraville Properties. The companies were registered in places like the British Virgin Islands, Liechtenstein, Jersey, Luxembourg, jurisdictions with strict banking secrecy laws. The accounts were spread across multiple banks: Credit Suisse, UBS, HSBC, Bank SCS Alliance, and dozens more. The money was then invested. Real estate in London, stocks in Europe, bonds, luxury goods. It was washed, layered, integrated into the global financial system. And it all happened with the active cooperation of Western banks. Let's be clear, the banks knew. When a Nigerian military officer opens dozens of accounts across multiple jurisdictions and deposits hundreds of millions of dollars, that's a red flag. When shell companies with no clear business purpose receive massive wire transfers from Nigerian government institutions, that's a red flag. When the same names appear repeatedly, moving money in patterns consistent with money laundering, that's a red flag. But the banks didn't ask questions. Because Abacha's money was profitable, every deposit generated fees. Every transfer generated commissions. Every investment generated management fees. Swiss banks alone held over $700 million of Abacha's stolen money. They made millions facilitating his theft. And when investigators later asked how the banks failed to detect the laundering, the banks claimed they were victims too, that they had been deceived. But internal documents told a different story. The banks knew the money was suspicious. They chose profit over due diligence. In June 1998, everything changed. General Sani Abacha died suddenly. The official story, heart attack. The rumors, he died in bed with Indian prostitutes. His body was reportedly found with traces of Viagra and other substances. Some claimed he was poisoned. Others said was natural causes, overindulgence. The truth remains unclear. But what is clear? His death created a power vacuum. General Abdul Salami Abubakar took over as head of state. Unlike Abacha, Abubakar promised a genuine transition to democracy. And almost immediately, the new government began investigating Abacha's finances. What they found was staggering. Nigerian investigators discovered that billions of dollars had been systematically looted. They found records of cash withdrawals, shell company accounts, offshore transfers. They found properties in London purchased with Nigerian money, luxury apartments in expensive neighborhoods. They found jewelry, vehicles, investments, and they began the process of trying to recover it. But there was a problem. Most of the money was outside Nigeria, in foreign banks, in foreign jurisdictions. Recovering stolen assets is complex. It requires cooperation from foreign governments, legal proceedings in multiple countries, evidence that the money was stolen, and it requires proof that the money in a specific account came from Nigeria. Not easy when it's been laundered through dozens of shell companies. Nigeria needed help. Enter Enrico Monfrini, a Swiss lawyer specializing in asset recovery. Experienced, determined, willing to take on a case that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. In 1999, Nigeria hired Monfrini to lead the effort to recover Abacha's stolen billions. Monfrini began by mapping the network. He traced bank accounts. He followed paper trails. He identified shell companies and their beneficial owners. He worked with Swiss authorities who began freezing accounts linked to Abacha. By 2000, Switzerland had frozen over $600 million in Abacha-related accounts. Other countries followed. Liechtenstein froze accounts. So did Luxembourg, the UK, Jersey. But freezing accounts is just the first step. Actually recovering the money requires lengthy legal battles. And Abacha's family wasn't going to give up quietly. Mohammed Abacha, the dictator's son, fought back. He hired expensive lawyers. He contested every freeze, every seizure, every asset recovery claim. His argument: the money was legitimately earned. Business profits, investments, nothing to do with corruption. He claimed he was a successful businessman, that his companies had generated the wealth independently. But investigators found otherwise. They traced money directly from Nigerian government accounts to shell companies controlled by Mohammed. They found letters signed by Sani Abacha authorizing central bank withdrawals, followed days later by deposits into Mohammed's offshore accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, but still, the legal battles dragged on. In Switzerland, it took years to move through the courts. Asset recovery laws were complex. Banking secrecy laws protected depositors. Abacha's lawyers exploited every procedural delay. In 2005, 7 years after Abacha's death, Switzerland finally returned $500 million to Nigeria. It was a victory, but it was just a fraction of what had been stolen. The hunt expanded globally. Monfrini and Nigerian investigators identified accounts in over 30 countries. In the UK, they found millions in accounts linked to Abacha. Properties in London worth tens of millions. In Liechtenstein, they found accounts holding over $200 million. In Jersey, a British Crown dependency with strict banking secrecy, they found more accounts. In the United States, they found millions deposited by Abacha associates. Each jurisdiction required separate legal action, separate evidence, separate court proceedings. It was exhausting, expensive, slow, but Monfrini persisted. By 2020, Nigeria had recovered over $3 billion of Abacha's stolen funds, $500 million from Switzerland in 2005. In 2017, another $700 million from Switzerland and Luxembourg. In 2020, $308 million from Jersey, and another $311 million from the United States in 2020, smaller amounts from other jurisdictions. But the recovery came with conditions. Foreign governments, particularly Switzerland and the United States, didn't simply hand the money back. They required that Nigeria use it for specific development projects, monitored by international organizations. They feared that without oversight, the recovered funds would be stolen again, and they were right to worry. In 2013, a scandal erupted in Nigeria. Investigators discovered that $16 million in recovered Abacha funds had disappeared. The money had been returned to Nigeria, deposited in government accounts, then vanished, stolen again, by Nigerian officials. The irony was crushing. Money stolen by a dictator in the 1990s, recovered through years of legal battles, only to be stolen again in the 2010s. Because Nigeria's corruption problem didn't end with Abacha. It was systemic, institutional. The Abacha family, meanwhile, remained wealthy. Mohammed Abacha was arrested multiple times on corruption charges, but he was never convicted. Cases collapsed. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence went missing. He eventually became a politician. He ran for office. He regained respectability. Other family members lived comfortably in Nigeria and abroad. They lost billions, yes, but they kept enough to remain rich. And Abubakar Bagudu, Abacha's associate who helped launder the money, he became governor of Kebbi State in Nigeria. He's a senator now. He reached a deal with the Nigerian government, returned some of the money, and will leave you alone. He returned millions. He kept his freedom and his political career. That's Nigeria. As of 2024, the asset recovery effort continues. Nigeria is still pursuing accounts in various jurisdictions, still fighting legal battles, still discovering new stashes. Estimates suggest there's still between $1 billion and $2 billion hidden somewhere, in accounts not yet found, in investments not yet traced. Enrico Monfrini worked on the case until 2021. When he finally stepped back after over 20 years, he recovered billions. But he also acknowledged the fight isn't over, because the system that allowed Abacha to steal hasn't fundamentally changed. 26 years after Abacha's death, Nigeria is still recovering his money. The process has cost millions in legal fees. Monfrini alone was paid over $20 million for his work, money that came from the recovered assets. And even with over $3 billion recovered, it's still less than what was stolen. And some of what was recovered got stolen again. Nigeria is still paying the price, not just for the money it lost, but for the institutions weakened, the trust destroyed, the cynicism embedded. Because when a dictator can steal by the truckload for 5 years, and his family still lives in wealth and power decades later, what message does that send? It says, steal big enough, and you'll never pay the full price. Some of your money will be recovered, but you'll keep enough. You'll lose some freedom, but you'll regain it. You might even become a governor. That's the lesson of the Abacha vaults. And Nigeria learned it well.